involved an exploration of shamanism. I'm sort of an outlier, I guess, at this event. But my first book, Breaking Open the Head, was about psychedelic drugs, psychedelic plants, visionary plants, particularly as used in indigenous societies, tribal societies. So I visited West Africa to work with a tribe called the Bwiti, who uses a substance called iboga. I was in the Amazon in Ecuador working with ayahuasca with a tribe called the Sequoia. Visited the Mazatec Indians in Mexico. This led me to a second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, where I was looking at prophecies that many indigenous cultures possess around this time. I guess in a way, I started as a skeptic and a scientific materialist through undergoing all sorts of shamanic experiences in different contexts. My worldview shifted to embrace more of a mystical, spiritual perspective, which was very surprising to me and something that I think we really can only access on an individual level if we undergo our own journey of transformation and inquiry. As she mentioned, the book that I'm finishing now is called How Soon Is Now, and essentially it's about looking at the ecological crisis that humanity now faces as a collective rite of passage or initiation, much like a shamanic initiation. And I think the German Jewish critic Walter Benjamin, writing in the 1920s, looking at the First World War, noted his belief that humanity has an innate need, a kind of impulsion to commune with the cosmic powers, he called them. And that we're always going to either satisfy this innate need through ritual, through ceremony, through some type of ecstatic celebratory event, or if that is blocked to us, it may happen that we end up releasing those same energies destructively. Obviously humanity has known for about a half century or more, well, really even since the 19th century, that the path of industrial civilization was coming into conflict with the ecological support systems of the planet. And I think we now know that we've reached a critical threshold, that we only have maybe a short period of time, 5, 10, 20 years, to really somehow redirect our activity as a species on the planet. Obviously what's happening at WeShare and in other types of engagements around the forefront of digital technology, there's this prospect that we could kind of transform our social system so that it is more in harmony with the planet, so people are collaborating more, conserving resources, sharing resources, and so on. So here we have Walter Benjamin in the 20s, looking at the First World War in that sense. An idea that's been explored a lot is that what makes us distinctly human is the prefrontal cortex, which only developed in the last 100,000 years. And that's what allows us to process abstract symbols, to plan for the future, and so on. An idea that the thinker Joseph Chilton Pearce developed in his book, The Biology of Transcendence, is that although the prefrontal cortex develops through adolescence, it actually requires a second kind of artificial shock to reach its full functioning. And that's why all these indigenous and traditional cultures around the world have initiation ceremonies that are often very difficult. They could involve the psychedelic experience through ayahuasca or peyote, or they might involve in Australian Aboriginal culture the walkabouts, where people have to fast and go on vision quests in the wilderness and so on. Modern civilization was the first one that did away with these types of initiation events, and therefore people develop without that second shock, which potentially leads them to shift from a purely egoic sense of identity to a more kind of transpersonal state of consciousness, which even if you only have that experience a few times can act as a kind of permanent reference point, where you're aware that that on some level there's a unity of consciousness underlying your separate identity. So I think that Western modern civilization ended up kind of caught in a trap, locked in its egoic structure, and based our whole trip on kind of hyper-individualism, accumulation of resources, and so on. And yeah, we've now reached a point where we can't go further than that. And in a sense, we could look at the idea that we've subconsciously, unconsciously somehow self-willed this ecological crisis to bring about our own transformation, our own transcendence. There's an idea that when disasters strike, people become destructive. But actually, a lot of people have noted that actually in extreme circumstances, whether it's Katrina or so on, people actually shift out of that egoic structure and go into a state of compassion and altruism and sharing and so on. Now, obviously, we don't need to go through this kind of disaster as a species to access that other capacity. But that seems to be the way we're heading now. And unfortunately, our society is basically programming people through media, through systems of education and indoctrination, to maintain kind of disempowered members of a consumer society. So yes, that's the basic thesis of the book. It's not that I think that everybody needs to take psychedelics or whatever, but I do think that understanding that we're in a species-wide crisis where our hyper-individualism is kind of keeping us from our next evolutionary kind of jump as a species is very crucial. And once again, what when I think about what this conference is really about, it's really about this potential. There's almost this question of whether the cutting edge of this technology is going to allow us. I mean, is it something that the corporate system, the business system, the governments are going to kind of assimilate into business as usual, or is there the capacity for it to lead to a deeper transformation? And I really liked what Vinay was talking about the other day about, for instance, through the blockchain, the potential to actually have a global democracy. And I guess I've been brooding on his speech ever since he spoke, and thinking about how he was talking about, the West would really have to be willing to kind of reduce our lifestyle significantly and almost go into a state of, being willing to make reparations, for the excesses of colonialism. And we're seeing in a lot of thinkers right now, I mean, it's amazing, because you read all these different futurists, and there's such a bifurcation. You have people like Roy Scranton, who wrote Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, who basically argues that it's too late to deal with the thrust of our civilization towards destruction, and we have to just sort of surrender into that. And then you have people like the people who wrote Abundance, Peter Diamandis, who see technology evolving exponentially, with the capacity to fulfill human needs on a global scale. We see a book called Post-Capitalism by Paul Mason, the work of Jeremy Rifkin, who are pointing to this, once again, this idea of a potential for an exponential scaling of sustainable technologies, decentralization, resilience, and how we could actually avert mega catastrophe. By shifting into this mode of distributed resources, participatory democracy, relocalization within a truly planetary framework, we have this precious opportunity over the next few years, we don't really know how many, to deal with this crisis. Does this resonate with people in terms of how they're feeling about what's happening? I mean, if you look at climate change, species extinction, ocean acidification, the planetary boundaries model from the Stockholm Resilience Group, we're really at that critical juncture where it's kind of make or break. And to get through that kind of initiatory journey that we have to make as a culture, maybe we could look at the 60s as a first stage of a voyage of collective initiation, where people accessed mysticism, movements of civil, society, social liberation, sexual liberation, racial liberation, equality, and so on. But that only reached a certain threshold in that time, and then it got kind of re-assimilated or reintegrated into the corporate mega machine. So now we're at this next level of this threshold of transformation, where you could look at it almost like a birthing process, almost like contractions of a birth. And the question is whether we are going to push through into a different social model. And in fact, another major theme of my book, which other people have also looked at, is this idea that what's emerging is this potential for humanity to realize itself as a planetary superorganism, right? A superorganism that's in a symbiotic relationship with the Earth's ecology as a whole system, right? And if we think about that, if we see ourselves as like a giant hive, we can see that that's also a trajectory of evolution. Biological evolution is often making this shift from competition, aggression, domination to cooperation and symbiosis. And we see a tremendous example of that in our own bodies, right? Our bodies were once, millions of years ago, colonies of microorganisms that were competing, in an environment for scarce resources, trying to eat each other, consume each other, as like Lynn Margolis talks about in Microcosmos. And then somehow in the midst of crisis, these colonies of microorganisms started to learn how to construct more complex kind of structures together, such as skin and eye and bones and so on. And we can see that everything that we're actually doing technologically is kind of replicating, stuff we already find in the microorganismic world, right? Like genes are able to transfer, viruses are able to transfer genetic information around the planet. Like the Earth, the Earth has a kind of internet, through the viral and bacterial world, through the mycelial world, which is able to learn how to break down different toxins and transmute them into nourishment and so on. So essentially, it's quite possible that humanity itself is actually still, even though we think we've separated from nature, we're actually in a kind of evolutionary biological process where we're moving towards our next level of emergence. Becoming aware of ourselves as a planetary superorganism and then acting from that perspective. In a way, we would have to kind of reverse engineer where we would want to get to from where we are now. Much the way Steve Jobs and Apple had to probably plan 10 or 15 years ahead for the smartphone, and think about everything that they would have to learn and accomplish to get there. We can begin to think about how we would learn and plan ahead for resilient, decentralized, zero carbon, negative carbon society that we could potentially recreate in 10 or 15 years, 20 years, 30 years. And we know a lot of the technology is already available. So that's kind of the basic thesis that I'm working with, sort of seeing, if we can use the crisis as an opportunity for humanity to make a shift from a destructive path to a regenerative one. And I really love the idea of a regenerative culture, regenerative society, as a deeper way of thinking about it than simply sustainability, which suggests the idea that we're going to sustain the old system, when actually that old system is exactly what can't be sustained anymore. From this model, this paradigm, I think it's also interesting to think about, well, if humanity is emerging into the state of being a superorganism, then what are the nascent organs of that collective body? And I think, strangely enough, they're actually multinational corporations. Like an energy company is kind of like the blood circulating through the body. A sanitation company is like the liver or the kidney that's like breaking down toxins. Media companies, social technology companies are very much like the perceptual mechanisms which are converting the raw data of sense perception into memes, into kind of usable chunks, for the collective body. But unfortunately, where we are now, it's all happening in this paradigm of fear, insecurity, negativity. The media is basically programming the collective body of humanity to not be aware of what's happening and what's facing us and how we need to change. So we, with 18 seconds left, have that opportunity to make that shift. And I think if we think about the possibility that corporations are these kind of nascent organs that are still in this kind of immature stage of competition, we could begin to think about what would be the next iteration of those structures. They would almost become something like transparent infrastructures that would be sharing knowledge and ideas freely, that would be supporting the health of the entire organism, just as the organs in our body is able to do. So that's my time. Wasn't very much, and it was very wonderful to talk to you. And come right next door. I'll answer any questions. We can chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel.